6 hours, 14 foreign volunteers, 3 heavily fortified Russian bunkers hidden deep within the mud and blood of the Eastern Front. It was supposed to be a standard clearance operation, a routine tactical maneuver in a war that had long ago forgotten the meaning of the word routine. When these 14 men, a mix of American, British, and Allied ex-military veterans, stepped into the freezing darkness of this deadly sector, they believed they were just taking out a forward observation post. They were wrong, completely, terrifyingly wrong. When they finally breached the heavy steel doors of the third and final bunker, their flashlights did not illuminate a simple infantry holdout. They didn't find a few cold soldiers huddled around a radio. What they found hidden beneath the frozen Ukrainian soil was a secret so highly classified, so strategically vital, that the Russian military had been willing to sacrifice hundreds of men just to keep it hidden. This is the untold story of one of the most intense, brutal, and consequential trench assaults of modern warfare. This is the story of how a suicide mission turned into a massive intelligence victory, altering the balance of power across the entire front line. What did these 14 men find in the dark, and why did the enemy fight to the absolute death to protect it? Strap in, we are going straight into the trenches. To understand the sheer madness of this mission, you first have to understand the geography of hell. In modern warfare, specifically in the highly contested Eastern Theater, there are areas known to the soldiers on the ground as dead zones. A dead zone is exactly what it sounds like. It is a grid square on a map where survival is not calculated in days, but in minutes. For over a year, this specific sector had been a meat grinder. The landscape looked like the surface of the moon, utterly scarred by thousands upon thousands of artillery craters. Every tree was reduced to a splintered stump. The ground itself was a toxic mix of frozen mud, unexploded ordnance, and the debris of endless mechanized assaults. But beneath this devastated surface, the Russian forces had spent months digging. They had constructed a subterranean network of interconnected trenches, fortified bunkers, and tunnel systems that were nearly invisible from the air. Why was this specific patch of dirt so important? Because it overlooked a critical logistical artery. From these hidden bunkers, forward observers could call in precision artillery strikes on any supply convoy attempting to resupply the front line. More dangerously, this area was a black hole for drones. Every time a surveillance drone flew within 5 miles of this tree line, its screen would turn to static and it would drop from the sky.
The Ukrainian High Command knew something was out there. They suspected a localized electronic warfare, or EW jammer.
But precision airstrikes couldn't penetrate the deep concrete and earth reinforcements, and sending in a large mechanized force would be spotted miles away, resulting in immediate artillery annihilation. The only way to take out this position was a ghost operation. A small, highly skilled, utterly silent infantry squad moving in on foot, under the cover of absolute darkness, to clear the trenches by hand. It was a mission with a statistically improbable survival rate, but the objective was too critical to ignore. You do not order conscripts into a dead zone. You ask for volunteers. And the men who raised their hands for this operation were a unique breed of warriors. They were 14 members of the International Legion, a specialized assault detachment composed primarily of combat-hardened veterans from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Eastern Europe. These were not green recruits. These were men who had served multiple combat tours in the mountains of Afghanistan and the urban deserts of Iraq. They understood close-quarters combat, but they also knew that the wars they had fought in the Middle East were fundamentally different from the hyper-lethal, drone-saturated battlefields of Eastern Europe. Here, there was no air superiority to call in a medevac. There were no quick reaction forces sitting in helicopters waiting to bail them out. Once they crossed the line of departure, they were entirely on their own. Their loadout was meticulously chosen for close-quarters trench clearing. Standard-issue body armor was stripped down to the bare essentials to maximize mobility. They carried suppressed assault rifles, a mix of customized M4 carbines and suppressed AK-74s to utilize captured enemy ammunition if necessary. But rifles only do so much in a trench. The real currency of trench warfare is high explosives. Each man carried an excessive amount of fragmentation grenades, thermobaric charges, and flashbangs. They also carried breaching shotguns, heavy trauma medical kits, and thermal imaging optics. Every piece of gear was taped down to prevent any metallic rattling. In the dead zone, noise is a beacon that attracts mortar fire. At 2300 hours, under a pitch-black, moonless sky, the 14 men gathered in a ruined basement for their final briefing. The plan was violently simple. March 3 kilometers across open, heavily mined terrain, penetrate the enemy tree line undetected, Assault the first bunker to create a breach, flood the trench network, and systematically clear the remaining 2 bunkers before the enemy could organize a counterattack. The estimated window of execution before Russian artillery would level their own position to destroy the attackers? Exactly 6 hours. The temperature was sitting at a bone-chilling -10 degrees Celsius. As the volunteers stepped out of the ruins and into no man's land, the reality of the war hit them instantly. The night was eerily quiet, save for the distant rumble of artillery miles away. But this silence was deceptive. The sky above them was infested. Though they couldn't see them, they could hear the faint, high-pitched whining of surveillance drones circling like vultures in the stratosphere. If an enemy drone equipped with thermal optics caught even a glimpse of their body heat, the mission would end in a rain of cluster munitions before they even fired a shot. To counter this, the team wore specialized thermal masking ponchos, essentially trapping their body heat inside, turning them into invisible ghosts against the freezing background. They moved in a staggered, tactical file. Every step was a calculated risk. The ground was heavily laced with anti-personnel mines, tripwires, and unexploded cluster bomblets. The point man, a former British Royal Marine, led the way, his eyes glued to the ground, scanning for the faint metallic glint of a tripwire. It took them 3 agonizing hours to cross just 3 kilometers, crawling on their stomachs through freezing mud, holding their breath every time a flare shot up into the night sky. Whenever a flare illuminated the battlefield, the 14 men would freeze, pressing their faces into the dirt, blending perfectly with the corpses and craters that littered the landscape. Finally, at 0215 hours, they reached the edge of the tree line. Through their night vision optics, the silhouette of the first bunker emerged from the darkness. It was camouflaged with logs and earth, almost invisible to the naked eye. The thermal scope revealed 2 sentries standing outside, smoking cigarettes, their body heat glowing bright white in the viewfinder. The volunteers fanned out, forming an assault line. The silence of the night was about to be shattered. The engagement began with devastating precision. 2 suppressed shots rang out, dropping the sentries before they could even exhale their cigarette smoke. But the sound of bodies hitting the frozen mud was enough. Within seconds, a machine gun from inside the first bunker opened up, tearing through the trees. The element of surprise was gone. It was now a sheer test of violence of action. "Contact front!" The shout echoed through the tree line as the volunteers unleashed a wall of suppressive fire. Tracers lit up the pitch-black woods in terrifying streaks of red and green. The assault team perfectly executed their battle drill. While one half of the team pinned down the bunker's firing ports with heavy automatic fire, the breaching element flanked hard to the right, sprinting through the mud, diving into the shallow entry trench. Trench warfare is not glamorous. It is an intimate, brutal, and terrifying form of combat. As the breaching element reached the entrance of the first bunker, an American volunteer unpinned a fragmentation grenade, cooked it for exactly 2 seconds, and hurled it through the dark firing port. The muffled explosion shook the ground. Instantly, 2 men pushed into the smoke-filled bunker, rifles raised. "Clear!" they shouted. But there was no time to celebrate. The first bunker was just the gateway. Now, they were inside the trench network. The trenches were narrow, barely wide enough for 2 men to stand side by side. The walls were shored up with rotting wood, the floor slick with freezing mud and blood. They were entering a maze, and down this dark, winding corridor lay Bunker 2. The enemy was now fully awake, and the radio networks were undoubtedly screaming for artillery support. The ticking clock had accelerated. They had to move faster than the enemy's ability to react. Navigating a hostile trench system in the dark is a psychological nightmare. Every corner, every turn, every shadow could hide an enemy soldier waiting with a shotgun or a rigged explosive. The volunteers employed a methodical, ruthless tactic known as the bite and hold. They moved corner by corner. The lead man would slice the pie, slowly stepping out to check the angle. If they met resistance, they didn't waste time in prolonged firefights. The SOP, standard operating procedure, was simple. Frag first, ask questions later. They hurled grenades around corners, waited for the bone-rattling detonation, and then immediately pushed through the dust and smoke while the enemy was stunned. But Bunker 2 was different. As they approached the central node of the trench, the resistance stiffened drastically. This wasn't a standard infantry squad. The enemy soldiers here were heavily armed, wearing advanced body armor, and fighting with a desperate ferocity. They unleashed a relentless barrage of PKM machine gun fire down the narrow trench, pinning the volunteers behind a bend. For 20 agonizing minutes, the advance ground to a halt. The volunteers were taking shrapnel from incoming grenades. The situation was deteriorating. If they stayed pinned down, enemy mortars would eventually find their range. They needed a circuit breaker. An anti-tank weapon, designed for armored vehicles, was brought forward. Firing a heavy rocket inside a trench is incredibly dangerous due to the backblast, but they had no choice. The operator leaned around the corner, aimed at the reinforced firing slit of Bunker 2, and pulled the trigger. The overpressure from the blast in the confined space was deafening, bursting the eardrums of those closest to it, but the rocket found its mark. Bunker 2 was neutralized in a massive cloud of concrete dust and splintered logs. The team pushed forward, coughing through the thick, acrid smoke, stepping over the debris. 2 bunkers down, 1 to go. But as they approached the final objective, the chaos of battle suddenly shifted into something entirely unexpected. Complete, unsettling silence. As the assault team rounded the final corner leading to the 3rd bunker, the adrenaline-fueled chaos of the firefight evaporated. There were no machine guns firing, there were no grenades being thrown, there was just a massive, heavy steel blast door set deep into the concrete wall. This made absolutely no sense. Standard forward observation bunkers do not have submarine-style, hermetically sealed blast doors. Furthermore, the trench leading up to this door was lined with heavy, insulated power cables running into the earth. There were complex, military-grade communication antennas protruding from the camouflaged roof above. The volunteers realized in an instant that this was not an observation post. This was a high-value target. The breaching expert stepped forward. He molded blocks of C4 plastic explosive onto the hinges and the heavy locking mechanism of the steel door. The team stacked up against the muddy trench wall, shielded themselves from the blast, and initiated the detonator. The blast ripped the steel door off its hinges, sending it crashing into the darkness inside. The volunteers flooded into the room, their weapons raised, expecting a final, suicidal last stand from the enemy. But there was no gunfire. They activated their weapon lights. The beams of white light pierced the thick dust, sweeping across the room. What they saw defied all their expectations. The room was massive, highly reinforced, and completely abandoned. The enemy personnel had fled through a secondary subterranean escape tunnel just moments before the breach. But in their desperate panic to escape with their lives, they made a fatal, catastrophic mistake. They left the machines running. The volunteers lowered their rifles, utterly stunned. They were not standing in a bunker. They were standing inside a state-of-the-art, deeply buried Russian electronic warfare command and control node. The room was humming with the sound of heavy generators powering banks of sophisticated computers, signal analyzers, and radar arrays. This was the source of the dead zone. This single room was responsible for jamming Ukrainian drones, intercepting encrypted radio communications, and blinding GPS-guided munitions across a 20-mile radius. It was a technological fortress, a high-value asset that intelligence agencies spend millions of dollars trying to locate. But the true victory wasn't just finding the hardware. The true victory was what lay on the desks. In their haste to evacuate, the Russian operators had failed to initiate their standard destruction protocols. They hadn't poured thermite on the hard drives, they hadn't burned the documents. Lying completely intact on the central console were the holy grails of modern military intelligence. First, the encryption keys. Thick manuals detailing the exact cryptographic codes used by the Russian forces in that sector to secure their radio networks. Second, the drone frequency logs. Documents listing the exact radio frequencies and hopping algorithms used by enemy surveillance and kamikaze drones. And most importantly, the digital hard drives were still plugged into the servers, containing weeks of log data, troop movements, and the specific coordinates of other hidden EW nodes along the front. The team leader immediately recognized the monumental magnitude of this discovery. He ordered his men to stop everything. They stripped off their heavy backpacks and began stuffing them with every laptop, every hard drive, every single piece of paper they could find. They ripped server blades from the racks, they photographed the stationary equipment that was too heavy to carry. They had just uncovered the enemy's playbook, but now they had to get it out alive. The 6-hour window was closing. The Russian High Command would undoubtedly realize what they had left behind, and a massive artillery strike on their own position to destroy the intelligence was imminent. The exfiltration was a brutal sprint against time. Heavily weighed down by the captured equipment and intelligence, the 14 volunteers navigated back through the treacherous minefields as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. Minutes after they cleared the danger zone, the sky tore open. Russian artillery rained down on the bunker complex, obliterating the EW node entirely in a desperate attempt to destroy the evidence. but they were too late. The 14 men returned to friendly lines, exhausted, battered, but victorious. They handed over the backpacks to military intelligence officers, and the impact was immediate and devastating for the enemy. Within 48 hours, the captured encryption keys were decoded. Ukrainian forces began listening to secure Russian communications in real time. The drone frequency logs were inputted into their own jammers. Suddenly, the skies over the dead zone were cleared. Enemy drones fell from the sky, blinded, while Ukrainian surveillance reigned supreme. Using the data extracted from those hard drives, precision strikes were called in on multiple previously hidden enemy command posts and supply depots across the sector. The defensive line that had held for months crumbled in a matter of days. What started as a highly dangerous, seemingly suicidal 14-man trench assault transformed into one of the most significant intelligence coups of the campaign. It proved a fundamental truth of modern combat. No matter how advanced the technology, no matter how deep the bunker, the outcome of a war is still dictated by the bravery, the grit, and the sheer audacity of the infantry soldier on the ground. These 14 foreign volunteers didn't just clear a bunker, they cracked the enemy's code. They turned the tide in a sector that was considered lost, and they did it all in the dark. If you want to see more deep-dive tactical breakdowns of the most intense operations on the front line, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. The war is constantly evolving, and we are here to break down every maneuver. Leave a comment below on what tactical operation you want me to cover next. Until then, stay sharp and stay informed.